Greetings, everybody. Today we're going to be continuing through the booklet entitled The Modern Romans, The Decline of Western Civilization. If you have been following along in this series of programs, you know that we have been going through the history of the mighty Roman Empire, its rise, decline, and fall, and drawing parallels with that superpower of that day and the superpower of our day, the United States of America, and trying to learn lessons, hoping that we will not repeat the same mistakes that Rome made and end up with the same fate that the Roman Empire ended up with. So now we're going to read from this booklet in the chapter with the heading, Militarism and a Calculated Risk. Reading from the booklet. Rome found herself, like the U.S. after World War II, in the unenviable position of being a world policeman. Her people grew weary of this burden and committed careless mistakes in a dangerous world. In a military age, surrounded by nations becoming more aggressive, hostile, and treacherous, Rome followed a policy that made her increasingly weaker defensively and more vulnerable to conquest. She thought her policies of defense would make her stronger, and for a while they did. But in the end, they destroyed her. Britain and the United States are experiencing the same problems today. The English already have become satisfied with a, quote, Little England, end quote, giving up their position as a world power. The United States is having grave difficulties. Despite the most awesome military machine the world has ever seen, the U.S. is losing power, prestige, and respect. America no longer seems able to win wars, just stalemates at best, not clear-cut victories. It's not that America and Britain have no power, it's just that we have lost pride in our power. We are uncertain how to use our power. But notice what God said he would do if we refused to obey him, which we have. Let's turn over here to a scripture just quickly in Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 19. Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 19. And I will break the pride of your power, God says, and I will make your heaven as iron and your earth as brass. So we do have awesome power, but the pride to use that power and the understanding of how to use that power is being lost. Continuing to read from this booklet. For hundreds of years, the Roman Empire possessed the most powerful, awe-inspiring, and disciplined military force in history. Does that sound familiar? We see that today in the United States of America and its allies. M. Rostovazev, in his book entitled Rome, said this, at its peak, quote, the Roman Empire was surrounded by a ring of military fortresses in Britain, on the Rhine, the Danube, and the Euphrates, in Arabia, Egypt, and Africa, end quote. But to support this ever-growing military machine with all its vast requirements for more fortresses, weapons of every kind, manpower, and food, required heavy financial burdens on the government and the populace. Taxes were high in order to support burgeoning military needs. The bureaucracy needed to back up the collection and distribution of supplies grew ever more complicated and corrupted in ancient Rome. From Diocletian onward, vast armament factories manufactured all arms required for the insatiable military forces. There were 15 factories in the Eastern Empire for production of shields and arms, in places like Sardis and Thessalonica. Other cities were centers for production of heavy cavalry armor. The Western Empire had its vast military-industrial complexes too. Quote, there were shield works at Cremona and other cities, a bow factory at Ticinum, a breastplate works at Mantua, sword factories at Lucca and Remi, and for catapult artillery there was a factory at Trevira, end quote. From the book The Latter Roman Empire by A.H.M. Jones. Other arms were produced elsewhere. Special factories produced bronze armor adorned with silver and gold for officers. Others produced uniforms for the troops and civil services. Quote, the armament factories must have been large establishments, for their personnel was a substantial element in the population of the towns in which they were situated. End quote. From the book Rome by M. Rostovazev. Now think about this. This is a familiar story to the economy of modern America and other nations today. The parallels that can be drawn between the fall of Rome and the decline of the United States and Western civilization are startling if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. Let's pay attention, and let's take note, and let's face reality. Continuing, Rome borrowed military techniques and tactics from other nations. This gave her the latest effective tools of warfare. In the early empire, the cool discipline and mastery of arms of her legions always won out in the end over the impetuous fury and more numerous hordes of many of her enemies. She might lose a battle, but she generally won the war. The Romans were masters in the art of siege warfare. They built complex towers to overrun the highest walls. This is what they did when they finally were able to conquer the Jews at Masada, a fortress so high up in the air with such sheer walls, it appeared that could never be done. But it was done by the Roman legions through the art of siege warfare. They developed huge protected battering rams to break down heavy wall fortresses. Besides the usual small personal arms, swords, spears, shields, bows, and arrows, the Romans developed fear-inspiring and devastating heavy artillery, much of it mobile. When going back over the centuries to the time of the Roman Empire, look at the advanced weaponry they already had developed by then. Crude when compared to the weaponry of today, but advanced when compared to the weaponry of their day. No doubt about that. They had catapults that could hurl 50-pound rocks 400 yards or more, nearly a quarter of a mile, wreaking devastating destruction. Other catapults could hurl bags of stones, the Roman equivalent of shrapnel. One device, called a ballista, could hurl a 12-foot flaming spear 2,000 feet or more over a third of a mile. A huge crossbow device could hurl smaller fire-tipped darts in rapid succession and strike home with great accuracy. In early times, the Romans refrained from allying large numbers of barbarian troops. The sons of the senators, nobles, and landholders produced the backbone and leadership of Roman legions. These were the courageous fighters who steadfastly fought for the protection and glory of their homeland, expressing the character and discipline of men engaged in the work of the state. Later, however, the armies of Rome were literally filled by barbarian soldiers, many of them former enemies. In fact, when speaking of the army of the empire in the West in the 5th century, we're talking basically about a barbarian army in the hire of Rome, and mostly an army of Germanic origin at that. The Russian historian Rostovazev relates the beginnings of this practice in his book entitled Rome. Quote, "In the troublesome times of the later Antonines, Rome needed a constant supply of recruits to defend her from the barbarians. Thousands fell in battle, and still more were carried off by pestilence. And further, the civilized classes grew less and less accustomed to military service and sent inferior men to the ranks. Hence the emperors preferred to employ a more primitive section of the population, field laborers and herdsmen from the outskirts of the empire, Thracians, Illyrians, Spanish mountaineers, Moors, men from the north of Gaul, mountaineers from Asia Minor and Syria. And so the army came to represent the less civilized part of the population." End quote. So Romans grew used to and even preferred to have these barbarians do the fighting for them. They had long grown used to them as neighbors. Some even settled on lands within the empire. They had long been well known as slaves, and gradually the Germans became the greatest leaders of the military. Defense dependency on former enemies or using mercenary troops is not new. And of course, you see more and more of that being done in Western armies of today. As pointed out by Roman historians such as Tenny Frank, a vast change in the Roman character, temperament, and national feeling developed as freed slave stocks and other Easterners proliferated to become the majority within the Roman heartland itself. In measure, this affected the quality of the armies of Rome, for many of the later Romans were unwilling to fight. Philip Van Ness Myers, in his book Rome, Its Rise and Fall, wrote this, quote, "Under the later empire, service in the army grew so unpopular and even odious that many cut off the fingers of their right hand in order to escape military duty. The government was forced to impose severe penalties for such acts. The result of this decline in the military spirit among the Romans was, as we have seen, that the recruiting ground of the legions became the barbarian lands outside the empire. The loss of the military spirit in the military age and this transformation in the armies of Rome could, of course, have no other outcome: the entrance into the army of a non-Roman spirit, and the final overthrow of the imperial government by the revolt of the mutinous legions." End quote. Then gradually, lower discipline and softer living further weakened the effectiveness of some of the troops, and rampaging corruption gripped many of the officers with evil effects. With the pressure of many groups of rampaging barbarian tribes threatening the provinces, Rome accepted the offers of some tribes to serve in defense of the empire as federated allies in return for money, lands, or supplies. Other tribes were forced en masse into the standards of Rome as a result of defeat in battle. Thus, the increasing threats of yet other ravaging barbarians pressured Rome into taking calculated risks and federating itself with uncertain allies. Rome even had to set up a foreign aid program to keep the barbarians from revolting. It was easier and cheaper to pay foreign mercenaries already in the provinces to protect the empire than to go to her own defense. The policies of the Romans were much like our foreign aid programs today. Rome hoped to buy her friends and keep the peace with gifts of money and supplies. But the plan backfired. Ferdinand Lott writes in his book, The End of the Ancient World and the Beginnings of the Middle Ages, quote, "To fight the barbarians and also buy them off and keep the magnificent edifice of the empire standing, great resources were needed." End quote. More and more demands were made by the barbarians. As these demands increased on all sides, Rome could no longer shell out the required gifts. The parallels between then and now are clear. If you read in your newspapers carefully and you listen to your newscasts with a perceptive approach, you will see that we are relying more and more on the approval of foreign nations for our security than on ourselves for our defense and security. And we maintain those relationships quite often, in spite of insults and in spite of rebuffs and in spite of refusal to help us out and cooperate with us through foreign aid, with little coming back in return. Rome did that also, and it contributed to weakening it as an empire and eventually helped to lead to its collapse. Because instead of relying on its own resources and on its own population and on its own character and resourcefulness, it started relying on foreign help and foreign allies and foreign armies, and that all backfired on them. Continuing. A new terror struck the fringes of the empire. Hordes of the terrible Huns were sweeping across the continent. Many German tribes fled in horror and sought Roman help. In A.D. 376, Emperor Valens permitted 1 million or so Goths to seek refuge within the empire. The Goths came as suppliants for protection, food, and shelter. If they were given lands and basic supplies, they promised that they would lead peaceful lives and provide auxiliaries for Rome's defense if required. William F. Allen writes in his book, A Short History of the Roman People, quote, "But the well-devised plan was frustrated by the knavery of the Roman officials who had its execution in charge. By their corrupt connivance, the Goths were allowed to keep their arms. By their greediness, the newcomers were defrauded of promised supplies, and by their perfidy, they were driven into open rebellion." End quote. Emperor Valens was killed in the Battle of Adrianople, A.D. 378, in an effort to control the insurgents. The Goths surprised the legions by introducing mounted cavalry, which cut the Roman forces to ribbons. The Goths were finally given lands, but it was the beginning of the end. The story was to be repeated again and again, in varying forms with many chieftains. The barbarians, though often militarily inferior, continuously took advantage of the corrupt, internally weak, and untrustworthy Roman government and military command. The rapacious barbarians slowly sliced off pieces of the empire until little was left of the Western Empire except Italy itself. In this period, Alaric the Visigoth, supposedly in the service of Rome, sacked Rome. because of slighted and cheated feelings. It was a sign of the weakness in the very heart of the empire. In 455, Geseric and the Vandals occupied and sacked Rome. The enfeeblement of the empire had a snowballing effect. It encouraged other treacherous allies and enemies to join in the excitement and opportunities for plunder. The pressure on the forces of the empire became unbearable. Finally, in AD 476, the fiction of Roman rule in the West came to an end when the Herulian Odoacer decided to replace the Roman figurehead Romulus Augustulus with himself. Rome, which had been at the mercy of her foreign allies and the barbarians, now fell before them in AD 476. An impossible occurrence in the minds of the citizens of the Roman Empire over a period of several hundred years. How could Rome ever be defeated? How could Rome ever fall? How could Rome ever be wiped out? The mighty Roman Empire, the superpower of its day. But it was. We need to take heed to this. And we need to learn from this. And we need to pay attention to the warnings from this. Grant Showerman, in his book Rome and the Romans, said this, quote, "The Roman army failed only at the end, and failed then because it trained in its own ranks the border nations that swept it back in the day of its old age and exhaustion." End quote. Dr. Robert Strauss Hupé, noted educator in international relations, summarized Rome's military woes this way, quote, "Rome's hostile neighbors turned more aggressive. For a while, appeasement of her enemies bought Rome peace. Then her strongest allies defected, and her enemies, encouraged by Rome's limp response to their provocations, renewed the attack and proceeded to ravage Rome's home territories, Italy and Gaul." End quote. Rome's calculated risk, her federations with questionable allies failed. Her allies turned out to be Frankenstein monsters. They turned on Rome and destroyed her. What about Britain and America today? Are we boxing ourselves in based on the same calculated risk of looking to former enemies and turning them into supposed allies and arming them to the hilt and depending on them for our security and safety? A number of years ago, a Navy official, Commander P.N. Searles, spoke out against the declining moral standards and values of society, specifically mentioning the new recruits he had to deal with. He said, "We can have the best missiles and ships and planes in the world, but they are no better than the men who operate them." Then he referred to Rome's fall. Quote, "Effete and over-civilized Rome lost its national will and national purpose and was overrun by the Vandals. Civilizations with a low standard of morality have been pushed to the grave throughout history by people with a low standard of dying." End quote. That's from Commander P.N. Searles. Character and purpose are the most important values. That's where the strength of a nation begins. Unfortunately, we have been neglecting these qualities and have relied instead upon sheer military power and armaments, along with the power of other nations as allies. Just as Rome made that mistake, we are making that mistake. I want to read a quick quote from a very famous and outstanding leader in history and a well-known leader, Mr. Winston Churchill. Here's what he said on the birth of Prince Charles, November the 16th, 1948. Mr. Churchill said this, "There's no doubt that it is around the family and the home that all the greatest virtues, the most dominating virtues of human society are created, strengthened, and maintained. That's where character and purpose are developed in the lives of individuals, in the home. And with the breakdown of authority and the breakdown of the home in the United States and Britain, this character and purpose in life that should be taught at home is not being taught to a growing number of people in our present generation. It is in some cases, but in all too many cases, it is not. This flaw begins to show up as the present generation grows into positions of leadership. They become the movers and shakers of the nation. They're the ones who are the captains of industry. the leading politicians, the generals and soldiers and masters of the destiny of our Western world and of our Western civilization. If there is a lack of purpose and if there is a flaw of character, this ripples right throughout every enterprise and every organization in our society. And instead of being the mighty United States of America and Great Britain, we become the feeble, weak, and dependent former superpower. The same process took place in the superpower called the Roman Empire. I want to read one other quote from a famous leader, Field Marshal Montgomery, one of the best known and most successful British military leaders in World War II. In his book, The Path to Leadership, he said this: "Leadership is based on truth and character. A leader must himself be the servant of a truth, and he must make that truth the focus of a common purpose. He must then have the force of character necessary to inspire others to follow him with confidence. Both are necessary, truth and character, with willpower in the character. And of course, they lead to an overall purpose. And this character and purpose produces important values that strengthen the nation. And so, this is at the heart and core of our problem today, and was at the heart and core of the problem that the Roman Empire had in its day." Continuing to read from this booklet, The Modern Romans. Today, the United States finds itself supporting, defending, and looking for support from former enemies, while former allies are now enemies or becoming more hostile to the U.S., or just indifferent to the U.S. And when trouble comes in the world, we find ourselves increasingly having to go it alone. Usually the U.S. and Britain going it alone in various battles and wars and uprisings around the world. Oh, there might be some that we defended in World War II and other conflicts that'll send token troops that are support troops, but in terms of being fully involved to help us out, they are disengaging more and more from the United States of America and becoming less and less our friends and our allies. The same thing happened in Rome. America and Britain chose to take a calculated risk when they rearmed Germany in fear of the Soviets. Increasingly, Japan and other nations are being asked to share the burden against the communists and other enemy organizations. Our trust is increasingly placed in allies to defend the borders of the American sphere of influence. We just can't do it all. And we don't want to have to do it all. And why should we have to do it all? But we're called upon, all too often, to be the one that seems to carry the major part of the burden of defending Western civilization. Now our allies are growing uneasy and alarmed about America's show of weakness and over-involvement with her internal problems to the point where they suspect America may not keep up its professed commitments. Is history repeating itself? We're becoming so preoccupied with social issues and with political turmoil and with internal problems that are becoming towering and unmanageable that our military reach and commitment and dependability is being called in question by our allies and so-called friends. And they are beginning to feel they can depend on us less and less to defend them in a time of crisis. And they themselves are unwilling to help us in a time of crisis. So it becomes more and more one way, from us to them, but not from them back to us. The same thing happened in the Roman Empire before its collapse. Is history repeating itself? Could it be possible that in the end our, quote, calculated risk, end quote, will be provoked to take matters into their own hands? Will it happen to us as to Rome? An ancient warning was applied to the biblical nation of Judah that could be a solemn warning to modern America. And we need to take note of it. It's found over here in the book of Lamentations, chapter 1 and verse 1. Notice what this says regarding a warning to Judah, and in type, a warning to America. Here's what it says in Lamentations chapter 1 and verse 1. How does the city sit solitary that was full of people? How is she become as a widow? She that was great among the nations, and princess among the provinces. How is she become tributary, or enslaved? Verse 2, Lamentations 1. She weeps sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she has none to comfort her, her allies, her friends, or former friends. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. Will that happen to the United States and Britain in the future like it happened to Rome? We need to take heed and watch for this development very carefully. It seems to be a growing sport from many nations to blame the United States for any or all world ills, and this should not be lost to anyone with open eyes, and open ears, I might add. Well, what about us as a nation, and above all, what about us as individuals? We can't change other people and force them to take the right action. But we can change in our own lives and take the right action and begin to look to God more and to human beings less for our security now and in the future. Notice what Zechariah said over here in chapter 4 and verse 6. Please get your Bible and turn and let's read this together. Zechariah chapter 4 and verse 6. Here's what God inspired in his word. Then he answered and spoke unto me, saying, This is the word of the Lord unto Zerubbabel, saying, Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts. We are getting to a point in history where developments are becoming so critical and so dangerous that we'd better start asking ourselves, where are we looking to for our security? Are we looking to alliances, allies, friends, and former enemies that now supposedly will rush to our aid? Are we looking to mighty military armaments and military power and might to protect us? Or are we going to return to God and look to Him for everything? That's what we'd better be doing. And if others won't do it, then we'd better be doing it individually. Because that's what God said right here. Not by might, military or otherwise, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts. Until next time, this is Charles Bryce with the Enduring Church of God.